Hey everybody, before this week's podcast starts, I just wanted to give you a heads up that Gwen and I talk about some kink in this episode that might be considered pretty extreme kink or kink that a lot of people don't talk about. And so if that's not something that you're comfortable with, then you might want to skip this week's episode. But my podcast is largely about trying to help people feel less shame about their sexuality and talk about things we don't talk about. And kinks is one of those things that a lot of people don't talk about. And a lot of us are turned on by different things. And I want to normalize that and give you an opportunity to listen to somebody who is really open about herself, her sexuality, and her kink life. And she does it in such a beautiful way. I think it's important to talk about these things and bring them out into the open so that we can understand not only ourselves better and have more gentleness and compassion with ourselves, but others as well. And in this podcast, we talk about disgust and some things that might trigger your own disgust, reflex, or judgment. And so if you decide to listen to this, I would really encourage you to just notice that with curiosity if it comes up, and to just really see that we are all amazing in our own personal sexuality in whatever turns us on, and that's part of the amazing like creativity and diversity of our humanity and our sexuality. So I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoyed interviewing Gwen. And again, I'm just so glad that there's people like her out there who are talking about this kind of stuff in a very open, human, accepting way. So enjoy.
Welcome to this episode of Sexuality After. I'm here with Gwen, and we were just laughing about dragon dildos, so that's kind of what you're in for today.
Yes.
I heard about Gwen because I listened to her story on another podcast called This Is Actually Happening, and Gwen is on the team that produces Off the Cuff podcast, which is a podcast about kink and BDSM. And they talk about everything kink and BDSM, the entire spectrum from sensual to sadistic and bizarre to vanilla, like they say. And yeah, I just really wanted to talk to Gwen and bring her on my podcast because she talked about her religious upbringing, which, as you know, is something near and dear to my heart, is people that have come out of religion. And she talked about her journey into kink and her own personal kink with disgust, which I found so fascinating because it's an emotion. Well, we'll probably talk about it, but it's an emotion that people try not to even really think about too much or talk about. And it's not even recognized a lot of times as a main emotion. And as sticky and uncomfortable as shame can be, disgust, I feel like, is one step further. And so I'd really love to get into her head with you guys tonight about her relationship with disgust.
Yay. I'm so excited.
Awesome. So to start with, I'd really love to hear about your childhood and some of the main beliefs that you were raised with around sex and sexuality, and kind of your journey through your sexuality and through religion.
Sure. So I grew up in a pretty conservative Christian household. I was forced to go to church every Sunday. I don't know if it really matters, but I grew up as a Nazarene. That was the denomination. I don't know a ton about the difference between different denominations, but yeah, I basically just grew up learning that any sort of like sex and sexuality was like off the table until marriage, or else you were going to hell. Hell was like a big part of my childhood, and like a huge like basically my main fear when I was a kid. I remember just like staying up at night being like horrified by just like thinking about hell, but then on the other side of the coin, I was horrified of heaven too because like
Right?
obviously like hell is horrifying. It's like you're being tortured and burned for eternity. But on the other side, you have heaven, which is just like praising Jesus on a loop for eternity, at least the way that it was described to me, like
Yes.
singing the same song on a loop, hanging out with Christians forever, and just like praising Jesus. And I think a lot of it was just the idea of eternity. Like I was never super I was like terrified by the idea of having a consciousness forever. Like I think just because especially as a kid, like and even now it's impossible to grasp that idea of like infinity or eternity.
Yeah,
And spending like eternity anywhere doesn't sound very good to me, and it never has.
totally. Especially if it's
Um,
a never-ending something. Yeah,
yeah, definitely, especially when neither option seems very great.
totally.
So, yeah, but I opted for heaven because I was like, I guess that's better than eternal torture.
Sure.
And so yeah, a lot of my views on sexuality were just abstinence based, especially even in school, like outside of Christianity. I received like very, very little sex ed, and it was all abstinence only. There was no teaching about consent or
Yeah.
like any of like, it was basically like, don't have sex.
Yeah.
And if
Don't
you
have
do,
sex and don't get pregnant and be careful.
yeah, it was basically like just deal with if you're going to have sex, then you're gonna have to deal with the consequences of being uneducated about it. Um, which was not great. But as a kid, I was also like super obsessed with sex, like from like a pretty young age. Like I remember I would always like rationalize it to myself in different ways. Like I'd be like, masturbation is okay. Even if I feel really guilty afterwards, at least like it was kind of like PIV sex before marriage was the big no no.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, maybe it's a sin to do anything else, but at least it's better than like fucking before marriage. So yeah, I would do a lot of like interesting like workarounds. Obviously, I wasn't able to obtain like a sex toy or anything. So I remember Googling like different household objects to use as sex toys. And like, this is like really embarrassing, but one of my first, or actually my first like sex toy was like stealing my dad's electric toothbrush that he never used it. It was just sitting in the bathroom, but I
Yeah.
would just like steal that and use it as a vibrator, or like I would use like bathtub faucets, or just find like really creative ways to like
Yeah.
make it happen.
Totally. You're not alone. I used a vibrating pen that I got and a Ken doll, like a Barbie doll.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's rad.
So
Interesting. I
we all
mean,
find our way.
I don't know how body safe that is, but like
Right.
it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um so yeah, I would also basically just like do like everything that I could except for have sex with like whatever boyfriends that I had throughout high school. And I also watched a lot of kinky porn, which I didn't realize was kinky at the time. I just thought that I was watching like porn that not a lot of people watched.
Yeah.
I also felt a lot of shame not only around being Christian and being like sexual as a teenager, but also being a woman or a girl and being sexual. Like
Yes.
I assumed that no one else that I knew that was a girl like jerked off. Like I just thought that it like I think I had the shame of like Christianity and being a teenage girl, just kind of like all like compounding on each other.
Yep.
Um yeah, I'm not sure how much further you want me to go into
Yeah,
it,
you can keep
but
going.
um
Yeah. So, like, what was your process of getting of coming out of religion? What kind of started that happening? And then what was your foray into kink? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah. So I was always really not always, but I think around when I was in high school, I started becoming a bit skeptical about Christianity. Like, I was fully in it. A big thing for me is that I've always been a perfectionist. And so I definitely was really like, I was like, for one, I had this big fear of going to hell. So I didn't like want to sin. And I also just wanted to like, there's this thing built into Christianity that's like you need to strive to be as perfect as you can be like
Yeah.
Jesus, but
Yeah.
also you will never be that. And
Right.
that always like tormented me because I knew I'd
Yeah.
never be able to achieve that thing, which I
Mm.
now realize is what keeps you in it is never being able to actually achieve that goal.
Yeah.
Um
Yes, absolutely. I relate so much.
yeah. But I started getting pretty skeptical about it when I would just ask my youth group leaders at the time a lot of like questions that I think they really didn't want to be asked, but they would just kind of have like open time for questions. And I would ask things like, what happens to babies that die? Like, during like the birthing process or like soon after their birth before they're able to like accept Jesus into their heart. Or I
Mm.
would ask about what happens when people kill themselves and why that's a sin because I was told that that was a sin and you would go to hell. Which I also struggled with a lot of like depression and like suicidal thoughts. So that was a thing that I asked about a lot. I also asked a lot about people in other cultures who don't even like know about Christianity because so much of religion is just based on what you're born into and the culture that you're born into. That I would ask why it was a sin or why people of other religions were going to hell. And it would basically be answered by just like everyone is able to find Jesus, which doesn't really make sense, but that's kind of the whole like missionary mindset of people
Yeah.
who go travel and like indoctrinate people that really don't need Christianity
Yeah.
into it. But
Yeah.
anyways, I asked a lot of hard questions, but I could not let go of it because of this like looming fear of hell. Um
Yeah.
but it was really in college, when I wasn't kind of like forced to go to church anymore, that I started to like grow away from Christianity. It was never like there wasn't a moment or anything where I was just like done with it, but I kind of just moved on to a different like kind of culty mindset. I got really into meditation and mindfulness. Which is like not a bad thing in all circumstances. Like you can I think really use meditation and mindfulness to your benefit and it's a big part of like mental health teachings and I think it's really important. But again, because of who I am and my like perfectionism, my next goal was like enlightenment, which was
Yes.
another like kind of trap where it's like you need to strive for this thing but it's actually impossible to reach this thing unless you're like the Buddha or something.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to reach it and you
Yeah.
also have no way of knowing if you have reached it. Like that was the whole trap with that is like if you say that you are then you
And
can't
you're
be.
not. Yeah.
And it was all like very confusing but that was my new thing to strive for. um and Also, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, but
Yep.
I should say that when I was like heavily involved with Christianity, I did feel a lot of shame, like especially around sexuality. Like anytime I would do something with like a boyfriend, or like anytime that I would like use porn to jerk off with, like there was like a lot of shame, and not even just with sexuality but just with like feeling like I was a bad person in general. Or like another thing is I was like never good enough for my parents. They were also like super hard on me, which is another thing that like compounded onto everything.
Yeah.
So within Christianity there was a lot of shame, but then uh joining more like hippie movement, like meditation and mindfulness groups, that's when like the disgust really started to set in
Oh.
because I got into a big thing along with like meditation and mindfulness was veganism. Like, I became, like, a lot more socially conscious, which I think also just can come with, like, college, but I took it to an extreme where I was just like I got really obsessed with the environment, and, like, animal cruelty, and it got really obsessive to the point where, like, it was hard for me to leave the house and go for a drive because I would obsess over, like, litter on the side of the road
Right.
and be just, like, disgusted by humanity, and it was hard for me to go to the grocery store because I would look at people's plastic bags and, like, um, I would think about, like, how many plastic bags were being used in the world that day, and then how many plastic bags have been used throughout the time that plastic bags have been used, and then I would think about, like I would try to, like, calculate however many thousands of years all of the plastic bags would be on the earth, and I would think a lot about, like, the cruelty of, like, toward animals in factory farms, like, I would just obsess over it and, like,
Mhm.
I was, like, actually, subconsciously, I think, placing a lot of judgment on other people by being like, "It's not that hard to take reusable bags to the store," or, like, "It's not that hard to be vegan, like, just don't." Like, I was just, like, really angry and disgusted at the world for, like, not seeing the world through my eyes, which
Yeah.
was, like, very warped at the time and, like, impractical, and it was all, like I couldn't let go of it because it was under the guise of, like, doing good for the world and the environment,
Right.
but it was really, I think, just this, like, perfectionism that was, like, really heavily ingrained to me within Christianity, just moving on to the next thing, like, the next chapter of my life.
That's really interesting. I forgot that that was a part of your journey, but I remember you mentioning that. There's I feel like we could just talk about that for a long time, but I wanna move on, but, um, I feel like disgust, now that you're talking about it, feeling disgust is a more it feels more powerful than shame. Like, shame is all, "Oh, it's my fault. I'm a bad person, I'm worthless, I'm not enough, I'm too much." Whereas disgust, um, is often about somebody else, and like you were saying, judgment, and that's like you're putting yourself in a more self-righteous place, like, "Well, that's disgusting," or "You're disgusting," and it's like, I don't know, there's a more sense of power there. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, definitely. I think we were kind of talking about this a little bit before we started, but I definitely agree that disgust is a more intensified version of shame, or maybe the next level of shame. I'm not sure exactly of the connection there, but at least for me, it moved from personal shame to outward disgust. Even
Yeah.
though, like, what really helped me move out of that was realizing that it was all based on, like, self-disgust, because I still never felt like I was good enough, and, like, I was always struggling with a lot of, like, mental health issues. I always felt like I was, like, letting people down. I was, like, the type of person who would get, like, upset if I didn't get, like, A's in school because I was, like, in college at the time, so, yeah, I was just, like, struggling with a lot mentally and never felt like I could be, like, good enough for myself, and I think that I directed a lot of that outward, and I, like, kind of used, like, veganism, which is, like, in my opinion, at least after, like, coming out of it now, was just kind of, like, a restrictive at least for me, it was, like, a way to, like, control and restrict,
Mhm.
like, something in my life,
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, I think a lot of my outward disgust was actually just, like, disguised inward disgust, and someone actually pointed that out to me, which was kind of the first step in moving away from that.
Yeah. I've heard that, um, from quite a few people's stories is that they use food. Their attitude towards food is often a way of controlling and being like controlling themselves and being a perfectionist within themselves. And it's like, well, I can't control anything but I can control the way I eat or how much I eat. A lot of times that's what drives anorexia and bulimia too, is just this desire to be this unachievable desire to be perfect or that you're not enough. There's a lot of stuff in there with food, I think.
Yeah, I definitely struggled a lot more with, like, more commonly known, like, eating disorders when I was younger, like, within, like, Christianity and all of that, like, that was a big thing for me, but then, again, I moved on to, like, veganism when I got into like, I became friends with a lot of hippies, and I was kind of doing the same sorts of things, which, of course, like, I'm not saying, like, veganism itself is, like, necessarily restrictive, like, I
Yeah.
still believe you can totally be healthy doing that if you're doing it right, but for
Yeah.
me, it was a way to, like, continue being restrictive and, like, uh feeling I've always, like not anymore, but, when I was younger, I really looked for, like, sets of, like, rigid rules that I could follow, and if I could follow them, then I could feel good about myself, so I think that was just another way of doing that for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're taught in Christianity, especially strict Christianity. We have our rules, and that's what you abide by. Like, we're not taught, I don't know about you, but I certainly wasn't taught critical thinking
Yeah.
or listening to yourself, like the ability to listen to yourself and your own gut and your own heart, your own head. I wasn't taught that. No, you follow the rules, external rules.
And that's easier, right? Is just being able to live by these, like, seemingly simple rules, but I think it really like, not listening to yourself, and, like, repressing your own feelings really builds up over time in a way that tends to be unhealthy, so,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Okay, awesome. So, veganism, and then you kind of realized what the root of that was, and then what?
Well, then we get into, like, the kink, more like sexuality part, I guess, I still dealt with a lot of, like, self-disgust, and I still do to this day, like, it hasn't really, I think I don't deal so much with, like, self-disgust as much as, like, just a perfectionistic attitude, like, it hasn't completely gone away by
Right.
any means, but, I was still really dealing with the self-disgust even though I realized that it was more about me than, like, the rest of the world,
Yeah.
um, and I kind of, like, accepted that what everyone else does is out of my control and it's like nowhere near my place to like impose my beliefs onto other people. Um and so I had started listening to this podcast off the cuffs that I now work for, but about kink and BDSM.
Yeah.
And again, like I was still like obsessed with sex that never really went away from me. And a topic that was like that commonly came up on the show was people using their like using kink to deal with their trauma. Um, like I heard of people who had like traumatic experience with knives who would like use knives in a therapeutic sense with kink, just to like help them like face that fear in a controlled setting.
Yeah.
Um, where like you're like you know what's going to happen, you're able to safe word out of that scene if you like are completely uncomfortable with it, and it's just kind of like it seemed like a really empowering thing to be able to like deal with these feelings in a controlled setting, and I heard that that helped a lot of people,
Yeah.
um, and so I never really heard people doing it with emotions like disgust, but that's something that really like intrigued me at the time. Like I was like, I wonder if that's something that I could do. Um, but I didn't think too much about it until I met my now partner Dick, who is one of the hosts of the show. Um, and we started talking and we started talking about a lot of our like quote unquote gross kinks, like used clothing or um like I don't know why I'm blanking right now,
Well, yeah,
but
I
like
remember you were talking about, like, dirty socks as one of them, like
yeah, like dirty
smelly socks
socks.
or um, like vomit. You mentioned that a couple times, stuff like that.
Yeah, or like gagging, all of that.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and so we started talking about like potentially playing with those things in a kinky context. And so yeah, that's what we did. We, like, played with them together. At the time, we were long distance, so we would, like, send each other, like, a lot of used clothing, or we would do, like, scenes online through Skype,
oh yeah, yeah,
where he would, like, have me gag myself with my own, like, panties for a while and would,
yeah,
like, direct me on how to do it, and, at the same time, we were also having a lot of, like emotional discussions like surrounding these scenes where he was like helping me work through a lot of these things or like talking about how he related to a lot of the same feelings that I was having at the time.
yeah,
And yeah, it was like really empowering for me to kind of like play with disgust in a way that wasn't negative. It was like a lot of fun and kind of like becoming friends with that feeling instead
yeah,
of like looking at it as the enemy. Just like
yes,
realizing that it's a feeling that's going to be there for me, like no matter what. Like I said, it's still like not completely gone away by
yeah,
any means. So yeah, just like playing with it in a healthier way rather than just, like, beating myself up for it day in and day out
totally.
was huge for me.
Like, let's take this emotion that I feel anyways, and can we have some fun with it?
Yeah, exactly.
And in doing what you're doing, you're walking directly into disgust. Like, oh, I'm going to purposely do things that disgust me
Yeah, like, I'm
or
just
that I
going to
find
face
disgusting.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important for a lot of things, like, the different groups that I was involved in with, like, Christianity. It was, like I think that's the thing that I'm, like, the most proud of myself for doing in my life was, like, even if it wasn't a moment, still being able to look that in the face and recognize it for what it is instead of, like, through the lens of, like, essentially a brainwashed person and just being able to look at it through, like, my own genuine, like, perspective.
Totally.
So I think that's important with, like, a lot of things that are negatively impacting you in your life, if that makes sense.
Yes.
As long as you're, like, able to do it at that moment. Like, I don't think you, like, immediately need to, like, push yourself, into uncomfortable situations, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what helped me a lot with the shame that I felt was like in coaching, I take people through an exercise where they like see their shame in front of them. And
Mhm.
even visualizing it can be scary and
Yeah.
like allowing it to talk. And then they move if they feel comfortable to do that. They move and they like become their shame and they act as their shame and they speak as their shame. And it's just, again, it's just a way to consciously meet this thing that seems so scary. And when we do that, we always find that it's not it's not so scary.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, did you find like things that your average person would find disgusting? Did you find those things turn you on before you started doing this, or did you approach it more from a therapy standpoint?
Um, I would say they turned me on before I started, using them in a more therapeutic sense, which is interesting. I'm not sure if that stems from, like, my childhood or, like, my personality or if it's a coincidence, but yeah, it's kind of always been there for me.
Yeah. So, I have like two main questions, right? My biggest burning question is it like the feeling of disgust that turns you on? Like, is it anything that you find disgusting or that evokes that feeling? Is that what turns you on? Or is it individual acts? Or is it the fact that you can find something sexy that like most of society would judge or like not find sexy? So more like the taboo aspect of it or something
Mm.
else?
Yeah, I think, um, a lot of it is, like, the feeling of, like, being disgusting is, like, a lot of it, like, it doesn't necessarily feel disgusting to me because it turns me on, but just kind of, like, the concept of knowing that, um objectively it's disgusting, like rolling around in your own vomit or something, or
Yeah.
like just like knowing objectively that that's a thing. And also I just like um I'm a switch. I don't know if like your audience is aware of like kink
Some of them
terms,
maybe,
but
some of them wouldn't, but feel free to explain it. Yeah.
yeah, it basically means that I like being dominant or submissive, or a top or a bottom, which aren't necessarily the same thing. But yeah, so I like bottoming or being submissive, and a lot of that for me has to do with like humiliation or degradation, or just feeling like beneath someone or feeling low. So I think disgust like plays into that for me, um like disgusting I associate with being like low, because it's like a big low point in my life, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
Um
more the feeling, it's not the feeling of disgust necessarily, but of feeling like you're disgusting.
yeah, definitely.
That's what turns you on.
Yeah, I would say so.
And is it
Yeah.
like anytime you feel disgusting, or is it just like if somebody else, uh, not in a scene or like someone that you trust, like shames you and you feel like they kind of make you feel disgusting, does that turn you on too? Or is it just within your, sphere?
Yeah, not at all. If someone shames
Okay.
me just, like, out in the real world, I would, like, not feel good about that whatsoever. A lot of it for me is having trust with, my partner that
Mhm.
I have 2 partners, but the partner that I, like, play with this with, who's Dick, who I mentioned before, because he's into a lot of the same things and also doesn't actually find them gross. We just pretend, or like not pretend, but we like play with that they are gross and just like the concept of them being gross. So it's in
Mhm.
a completely non-judgmental environment, so I can like feel free to be as like quote unquote disgusting as I want without like, even though we're playing that I'm being disgusting, I know in my head that like no one is actually judging me in real life, which is a huge part of it.
Yeah. So after I thought about your podcast a lot since listening to it, and just like how could I relate? I think, and my husband and I were talking about it today. Like, I think that I feel similarly about taboos. So, um, I can play around with taboos and like, oh, this is naughty, or this is like not conventional, what most people, like other people would maybe judge me for this or judge us for this. And it's like sexy to kind of play with that taboo. But if somebody outside of my trusted circle, judges me or shames me for something that I would do sexually, that doesn't turn me on. Like,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
You also asked me if I'm into a lot of disgust or like gross play for the taboo of it, which is interesting because like I don't know how to explain it exactly, but that's a part of it, but it's more so the idea of it being a taboo, like I was saying. Like
Yeah.
I
Cause
don't actually want like it's not so much the idea that not a lot of people are into it that turns me on about it. Like I wish that in general people were more accepting of a lot of the kinks that I'm into, because some of them tend to be like outliers even within like the kink community.
totally. Yeah.
But
Disgust being one of them,
yeah.
like disgusting things. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So I think like the idea of it being a taboo is hot, but in reality I wish that it were not judged as harshly as it
Yeah.
sometimes is. Yeah.
I feel the same way about taboos.
Mhm.
And again, like I don't find them taboo. I'm totally fine with them. I feel very comfortable, doing the things that I do sexually, but yeah, this idea that people would find it taboo is hot, like you were saying. But I
Yeah,
also
yeah.
wish it was more mainstream so it wasn't as taboo.
Right. Yeah,
No,
it's
we can't have it
complicated.
all. Either yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking as well about, because I've never found like disgust. or feeling disgusting to turn me on. Like that's never been something that's happened for me. But as human beings, I think we do find a thrill in disgust and disgusting things. Like I was thinking about it today. Like um people find pleasure and or like they laugh at farting and like holding the covers over somebody's head, right?
Right.
Or even I have a little kid and like giving him slime. Like what's this fascination with slime? It's because it like feels it's like oozy and kind of gross, but it gives people like a thrill of like, oh, so disgusting. And then even horror movies too. Like, yeah, some of them are about fear, but disgust also plays into horror movies a lot where people are like, oh, it's so gross. Ew. Ah.
Yeah.
But they find a thrill in it, right?
Yeah.
And
That's
so
definitely the case for me anyway, yeah.
does that does that so then I was thinking with taboo, I find a similar thrill, like, oh, somebody could catch us, or like that's kind of a common one about being caught, right? Or oh, what would other people think or something? It's kind of like the same kind of thrill feeling. So I
Mhm.
was wondering, does that thrill feeling turn you on?
Hmm. I'm trying to think about that because I think it might if I weren't as open about it like online as I am. Like if it
Mm,
were kind of like my own secret, I would be like, "Ooh, if people found out about this, what would they think?" But my like sex and kink life is pretty out there, so like it's not common, but here and there like I will see like comments about it that are like people's genuine reactions to the things that I do. So I think that's kind of like I think that would definitely be a thing for me if my like sex and kink life were more private, if that makes sense.
yeah,
But it's interesting what you were saying about like just like people finding thrill and disgust in everyday life because I think that like when you talk about like doing like scat or human toilet paper play, which I talked about a lot in my this is actually happening, like people are quick to like not like empathize with that or like understand that at all. But on the other hand, like people, at least like I know my parents or a lot of people my parents' age are obsessed with watching the news, which is full of like dark, disgusting things that they like can't stop watching. And I think like people a lot of times do get this kind of like twisted like thrill out of like the media. And I even used to do that. Like I was like obsessed with like researching like dark things like
mhm,
going on in the world, which had a lot to do with my like my own disgust thing. But I think like yeah, like horror movies, like just even real life things in the media, I think people can kind of like get more of a thrill out of disgust than they realize. But again, it's not a super commonly recognized emotion. So maybe
yeah,
people might not recognize that.
yeah. And people also have a different level of like disgust sensitivity. Like,
Yeah.
I think my disgust sensitivity is fairly low. Like, there's not a lot of stuff that really disgusts me.
Mhm.
But for some people, they're disgusted by a lot of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think that you're like on a scale of 1 to 10, uh, let's see, 10 being like you're disgusted by a lot of things, like you find a lot of things disgusting, and 0 being you find nothing disgusting. I would put myself at like, I don't know, probably like a 3 or 4, maybe. Like, do you still find things disgusting? And where would you put yourself on that scale?
That's so interesting. I feel like I can't give a solid number because it depends. Like I find I still to this day, like, get disgusted just by, like, a lot of issues in the world. Like,
Mm,
I feel like I have a hard time not being cynical about things, like, I just see, like, negativity within, like, so many things, especially, like, just, like, within the past year, like, a lot of the stuff that's been happening, like,
Yeah.
politically and such, so
Mhm.
but I can't let myself, like, really, like, dive into that emotion anymore, like, I've become better at, like, realizing that it's out of my control, so it's not as intense of a feeling as it used to be, but I would say, like, it's hard because when it comes to, like, real world issues, I'd put myself at, like, an 8 or a 9, but when it comes to, like, things that you would typically think of as, like, gross or disgusting, like throwing up or, like, scat or, things like that, I would put myself at, like, a 1. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like there's a
Totally.
big difference between things that I feel emotionally, like, attached to and things that I just, like, play with, like, on a pretty regular basis.
Before you Do you think before you started playing with it in a more, like, kink context, do you think you were already at a 1 out of 10 with disgust? Like, you didn't find them disgusting?
I would say I would probably put myself before I started playing with it, maybe at, like, a 4 or a 5 just
Okay.
because I had no experience with it, so, um, that's, like, a big thing with kinks, I think, is you can be really into the idea of a kink, and you don't know until you do it, like, how you're actually going to feel about it a lot of the time.
Totally.
And it's totally fine if, like, if a kink stays as something that you fantasize about and something that you never play with in your entire
Yeah,
life, but, luckily for me, it was, like, genuinely something that I wanted to play with, like, practically. So,
yeah.
yeah, I would say that it, like, just, like, actually playing with it made me even less disgusted by these things, or I just kind of, like, turned it into something sexy,
Mhm.
but I wasn't completely sure before I actually played around with it.
Yeah. Hmm. Another question I wanted to ask you was, let me know also if you're like, "I don't wanna answer that question." That's
Yeah,
totally
for sure.
acceptable for me. Um, okay, so my husband and I, we've been to a few kink clubs,
Mhm.
and, like, there doesn't seem to be a lot of sex that happens at kink clubs.
Mhm.
And so I was wondering, does your kink play, like, turn you on where you want to have sex or, like, have, like, PIV sex or, like, any kind of sex, I guess, that takes you to orgasm? Like, is it kind of like that, or is it more of a mental? I know a lot of people when they play with control, for example, it's like, oh, like they kind of go into a meditative place where all they can focus on is the pain of, the spanking or the whipping. And so they can't focus on all the million things that are causing them anxiety, for example, or with, yeah, control play too. It's like, oh, I'm in control all the time in my life. And
Mhm.
so I get to be totally out of control and it just allows them to mentally relax. But doesn't necessarily take them to orgasm. Can you like
Yeah.
speak about that from your own experience and others?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, like, really subjective, but for me personally, I think that, um subspace is which is essentially like that meditative feeling of like that sometimes comes from like pain experiences, um but also can just be from that sense of like being controlled or like dominated, and it doesn't happen for everybody, and like different things get people to that space just like depending on what they're into or the person that they're playing with. um, but for me, that kind of like meditative, like obedient headspace tends to be more rewarding than like an orgasm or having like PIV sex. Um, but sometimes it does lead into that, or sometimes just like seemingly like vanilla PIV sex is just like what I want that day, or just like giving a blowjob is what I want that day. But most of the time, I would say just like doing kinky acts is like more rewarding than actual like PIV sex.
Can you tell
Which
me
I
more
think
about
like
that? Yeah.
sure. Um, I'm
Like
trying to think.
rewarding how? Like what is the reward? What do you see as the reward of like PIV vanilla sex? And what is the reward of kinky, kinky play for you?
Hmm. Well, I think for me personally, it's like kind of uh formed by my like past because um I thought that like PIV sex was like the only thing that I was going to have throughout my entire life, even though I like secretly like wanted
Okay.
like an alternative sex life. I didn't think that that was like possible for me because of like it being a sin. And I also just had a lot of like kind of like negative coercive like experiences for my first like PIV sexual experiences with
Mm,
like non-kinky people.
yeah.
So I think like I always wanted to ask for that, but I didn't know how, or I was afraid of like being judged for wanting that. So I think that's why for me now it's more rewarding to like ask for more like creative ways to like experience sex. And also my definition of sex has like broadened so much more than like PIV sex or um yeah, I don't know. I think it's like it's also a lot more rewarding for me at times because of the amount of planning that can go into a scene, um, rather than just like there's it's definitely like rewarding for me to just like be like, we're gonna fuck like spontaneously. Like
Yeah.
that's amazing. But there's also like it's really rewarding to like plan a role play scene for like have it in like plan it with your partner for like 6 months and then finally do it, or like building a dynamic with your partner no matter how like complicated it is and doing something based on that dynamic. Like I think I appreciate the amount of like creativity and or planning that can go into it, and also the amount of like trust that it takes
Mm.
to like play with things like pain or disgust. Like it's just kind of like on a different it tends to be on a different level, like, emotionally for me than just, like, fucking or, um yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It definitely does. In a small and slightly different way, it reminds me of the difference between, for myself, anyways, the difference between like light conversation and really deep, vulnerable conversation about sort of uncomfortable things. Or if you're like, hey, I really want to talk to you about this. And it takes a deeper level of trust and it's a lot more vulnerable, but you grow from it and you change from it. Whereas with lighter, um, surfacey conversation, you don't plan for it. You can have it on the fly and you can like do it whenever, but it doesn't change you as much.
Yeah, I would say that's a really good comparison. Like, it means so much to me because, especially just like from the background that I came from, I never would have imagined that I ever would have been able to open up to someone about like my vomit fetish. Like, I just didn't think that that was
Totally.
something that would ever even be possible for me, or like having someone who I could share dirty socks with, or like it was something I, like, fantasized about my for my entire life, but I didn't even think that I was going to be able to, like, have sex until I got married when I was, like, however old. So, yeah, I think that's a really good comparison and why it's so meaningful to me.
Mm. And there's really something to be said for like, man, like meeting somebody that you can share that with, who celebrates you for it and loves you for it and accepts you so completely in something so taboo. Like even in the kink world, like you were saying, I mean, that's like that's like the kinky of the kinky, right? And so to be able to say, you know, this is something that turns me on, and for someone else to be like, cool, let's play with it. It'd be like, what the fuck? Like
Yeah.
most people would totally judge me for this, and you are just accepting me for it. That's like really beautiful.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that recently. I think that my favorite feeling in life is sharing something vulnerable with someone that I'm like nervous to share and have them being like completely accepting of it.
Totally.
Which I'm like definitely lucky enough to get with both of my partners, but I think I like faced so much of the opposite of that for my entire life that it is such a, like, relieving and relaxing and, like, euphoric feeling is just, like, feeling accepted, like, literally no matter what, that's huge.
I mean, arguably, it's the best feeling in the world.
Yeah, I would agree, personally.
Like, I'm just trying to think right now if I can think of anything that feels better than that. Right? I mean,
Yeah, I
I
don't know if that just I know you
I
grew up
can't.
in, like, a kind of, like, uh, within, like, perfectionism and, like, never being good enough, and with, like, a mindset of, like, you're born into, like, being imperfect, so I don't know if it just, like, comes from that background or but, like, that's
I
my
mean,
perspective anyway.
well, so our basic human emotional needs are love, safety, and belonging, right?
Mhm.
And when we tell somebody something super vulnerable and they totally accept us, it meets all of those three needs. We feel
Yeah, like
safe with them, we know that we belong with them, and we feel loved by them. Um, anyways, I have to think about that, but
yeah, it kind of
I
hits all
really,
3.
it really does, and I really don't know if there's any better. Okay, if anybody's listening to this and they can think of something that feels better or that is a more powerful feeling, let me know. Let us know,
Yes, I would love to know.
because I think that's about it. That's like, I think that's one of the best feeling, or the best feeling. Anyways, yeah. So that makes sense why bringing that to, your bedroom or your kink dungeon or whatever it is for you or anybody else, being vulnerable and open, being accepted and celebrated for that is really powerful and beautiful to experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Oh, yes, that was the other thing. So you were saying that you're pretty open about this online. And, we were just talking about being judged and shamed and how being vulnerable and then having people accept you is so powerful and quite likely the best feeling in the world. And so, how do you deal with, okay, like, how do you have the balls to talk about that kind of stuff in public where people can and probably do judge you or shame you for your kinks? Like, how do you face that? How did you create that resilience, the shame resilience around being judged?
Mm, I think a lot of it was just being sick of, like, feeling that way, like, it just came to a point where I got, like, so fed up with it that I was just like, "I'm going to play into it," and also I don't, actually get a ton of, like, rejection or pushback or negative comments. I think because like a lot of or pretty much anyone who listens to Off the Cuffs, the podcast that I'm on, is looking to learn about like kink and
Mm.
BDSM, so they're probably like open to it.
Like nobody closed-minded is gonna be like, "I'm gonna listen to a kink podcast."
Yeah,
Right.
the only time I ever got, like, some negative comments was after this is actually happening, but it was, like, so few, and they weren't, like, directed toward me or anything,
Mm.
it was just kind of, like, when I would, like, see, like, general discussion about the episodes, and still, it was, like, so few, and I got, like, so many messages of people being like, "This really spoke to me," like, it, like, heavily outweighed, like, anything negative that I saw, which meant a lot to me because it was, like, very
Totally.
vulnerable and the first time that I had ever shared, like, my full story, but and I'm also, like, not super open about it to, like, family and friends yet, like, most of my friends know that I work for, like, a kink and BDSM podcast, but I don't think they've, like, listened to it, and I'm not, like, open about it to my family because, again, like, conservative Christian, like, I just don't feel comfortable or, like, safe at the moment doing that, so I haven't had the balls to, like, do that, but it's still been big for me just to, like, be open about it, like, on social media and on the
Yeah.
podcast and, like, show my face and yeah. I
So
I
you
hope that
pick
answers your
and
question.
yeah, so you kind of pick and choose communities that would be probably safe for you to share your vulnerabilities with,
Yeah, other
which
than with, like, my
makes
family, I'm not
sense.
gonna, like, hide it if people ask about it, but I just don't feel the
Yes.
need to be like, "This is everything about me," unless people are, like, asking me directly about it or if they're,
Right.
like, interested, if that makes sense, like,
Yeah.
people in
Yeah.
my life are free to, like, approach me about it if they want to, but I don't feel it's necessary to be, like, super open about my sex life to people who don't ask me about it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very similarly, like if people ask me, I'll talk about it, but I don't need to just go tell people about my my sex life. They don't wanna know about it,
Yeah.
right? That's fair. Um, I'm gonna ask you the question that everybody asks me, okay?
Okay.
Aren't aren't you afraid that your family will or, like, how would you feel if your family listened to your interviews or, like, that this is happening? Like, are you afraid that they'll find it?
Honestly, I am, like, afraid that they'll find it, um, because, like, I just have, like, fears surrounding my family just from like for like a lot of reasons, but it doesn't outweigh the feeling of like freedom about like being myself and being open about it. Um so
Mm.
if they were to find it, like I would just I'd probably, like, be disowned, but I would just, like, have to deal with it at that point because it's not worth, like, hiding who I am and what I'm passionate about, and, like, I love my job so much, like, I wouldn't trade it for anything, so, like, including, like, acceptance from or including, like I don't know what I'm trying to say, but,
Including the approval of your parents, maybe?
yeah, thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah, including
yeah.
the approval of my parents, which would probably never happen anyways, so there's kind of, like, no point in trying, like, they're kind of just the type of people who are always going to look for, like, something to be disappointed in, so it doesn't really matter if it's, like, this or something else. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I find that I am developing an allergy to to pretending or
Yeah, I feel that.
hiding because we had to do that for so long
Mhm.
for disempowered reasons that it's like, I just don't fucking wanna do that anymore. I'm done. Like, I am who I am. If people don't like it, they don't like it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, my attitude is like people can find me. Like I have an OnlyFans. I am on a Kink and BDSM podcast. Like people can find me. I just don't feel like I owe it to like my family to be super open to them if I don't want to be. Like
Yeah.
if they find it, that's one thing, but like I don't owe it to them to like share everything
Yeah.
about my life. So
Yeah. When people ask me that question, it's like, I just, like, my family doesn't listen to the stuff I make. Like,
yeah.
I think they know that I'm a women's sex and emotion coach. They know that, and they know that I have a YouTube channel and a podcast, but like, I don't think they want to know any more than that. Like, I don't think they really want to.
Yeah, there's not interested in
Well, it's like
like
too far out of their comfort zone to really to actually listen to it. And I think
yeah.
they kind of know that. It's like Phoebe's just doing her thing. She's
Mhm.
just, I'll just pretend that it's all stuff that I would approve of. Like, I think, I don't know. I think that that's kind of how they are. Maybe not. Maybe they listen to like everything I produce. I don't know, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. That's amazing. Oh man, I feel like I can talk to you for like 2 hours. Okay.
Aw.
Um, okay. I'm just looking at my questions, my like very personal questions to you. I think I went. Yeah, I think I went through all of the like super personal questions for you. Okay. So, what do you wish everyone in the world knew about sex slash sexuality slash, body relationships?
Mm.
Yeah, and why?
I don't know if this is like what I wish that people knew necessarily, but I wish that just more people were able to like get outside of the idea of like PIV sex being this like ultimate thing to reach, or like orgasm being like a goalpost for sex. And I guess I just wish that people were more open to, like, I think that people think about like the label of like kink and BDSM and are like, I'm staying away from that a lot of the time. But I wish that people could just like be a little more open minded and just like at least do their research into it. Because I think that a lot more people could benefit from at least like knowing that it exists, instead of it just feeling like this like hidden like little group of sexuality. I think that yeah, people could potentially find rewarding things within it if they were open to it. um yeah.
Totally. And different rewards. Like everybody kind of gets different things out of it, from what I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah, there's so much of it that I feel like people don't even know exists, or they have this idea in their head of like like someone going to a pro dom and like getting whipped, or like when
Totally.
it's like so much more broad than that. So
Yeah.
like I feel like I wish that sex in general wasn't this kind of like tip of the iceberg thing, if that makes sense.
Totally. I think that would require people to face themselves though, and like face uncomfortable things. Like you can't do kink without facing your shadows and your like emotional self.
Yeah, I would
I
agree
don't
with
think.
that. Even just in the fact that it's like seen as like weird or like unconventional, and it can be difficult to like accept that you're a part of this group that's labeled as like weird or unconventional. So even just with that, aside from like whatever like kinks you might have or fetishes you might have, like
Totally.
I think that's kind of like a baseline thing that most people face before like getting involved with a community. So,
Yeah. And I mean, I also want to point out that everybody has a different line as to what kink and kinky means.
yeah,
Like,
definitely.
I don't know. Like sometimes people talk about things and they're like, "Oh my god, that's so kinky," and I'm like, "It is,
Yeah,
I guess." And then And then I would label some things as kinky, and some things I would label as kinky, you'd be like, it's totally normal. It's like super vanilla. I
Yeah,
see
no,
it all the time,
it
right?
depends on the context too, like, a blowjob or PIV sex, I feel like I've been using those as examples as, like, non-kinky things, but even those can be, like, totally kinky, depending on the context of the situation,
Right.
so yeah, or even, like, I have a thing with my partner where as, like, a service, I, like, get him tea twice a day. So you wouldn't think of, like, getting tea for someone as, like, a kinky act, but it is for me. So, yeah, I think it totally varies from person to
Yeah, I love
person.
that. That's
Yeah,
very true.
yeah.
So, what makes what makes something kinky? What makes getting tea kinky, but like, you know, vomit play normal for like I'm just trying to think even for myself, what makes something what makes it kinky for me?
Mm.
For me to draw the line and say that's kinky. What makes that line that line?
I mean, this is kind of probably a really basic answer, but I just think whatever you consider to be kinky is. Yeah, again, not a very interesting answer, but it totally varies from person to person and the context that you like put it within. Like, I don't know. That's a really good question.
Okay. We'll get back to you on that.
Yeah,
Like, I
I
mean,
have
part
to
of
think
it
about
is
that.
the intention, obviously, behind it,
Mhm.
why you're doing something, and your line, like, we have a line of what we're super comfortable with and what we're kind of like, I'm not so sure. That can be kinky. That line can be kinky. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, so subjective. You also, like, don't even necessarily need, like, a partner to do like, you can totally be
Totally
kinky by
not.
yourself,
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
because a lot of, like, things I would consider kinky have to do with, like, a dynamic, but I'm thinking about that and I'm like, "No, you don't even need another person." Like, you can totally practice kink on yourself or just, like, with yourself or, like, watch kinky porn, and that's not, like, any less valid or less kinky, so
Totally.
yeah. I wish I had a better answer for that. I'm gonna have to think about it more.
Yeah. I remember, I remember this is a good example of like being kinky by yourself in a somewhat vanilla way. But going to church with like, you know, like very churchy clothes on, but having super hot underwear underneath.
Yeah, that makes a
That was
lot of
something
sense.
like looking back, that was something a long time ago that I did that I felt really kinky about and like really
Mhm.
sexy. And like nobody else knew, which is why it made it so kinky, right? It's like you think I'm just a good little Christian girl, but if you can see what's under these clothes, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good example.
So like a good vanilla example of kink. Yeah. Um, okay. What has been your hardest one understanding about sex or sexuality? Like one of the most difficult things for you to understand and come to realize?
Hmm. I would say it's like I would say just, like, the hardest thing, just throughout my entire life for me to come to realize was that it's not a sin to, like, have sex and experience pleasure, like, I was, like, heavily, like, brainwashed into this way of thinking, like, I had a purity ring, it was, like, this whole thing, and I also had a lot of, like, like different classes throughout like youth group in church where we would like learn about how it was like sinful to dress with like just like dress too revealing because it was like tempting to boys. And so it was just like 17 years of my life of this like sex is a sin, like through school and through church. It was just like very heavily like imposed on me. So I think that was probably the hardest thing for me to understand, even if like there was this thing like nagging at me in my brain, like telling me that it didn't really make sense or that there wasn't great reasoning behind it. Again, it was just like, yeah, that big looming fear of going to hell that keeps you from doing it. So, and like even to this like day, I still like every once in a while will be like, but what if? Like, but what if that's still true? Like, that's what makes me feel like it was like really like a traumatizing experience is because like to this day, like no matter like what logic I use to like reason myself out of it, it's like I think it will always be like this tiny thing of like, what if it is true? Which is ridiculous, but yeah.
Hey, that is not ridiculous. It's super freaking normal, let me tell you.
Yeah.
All the people I know. Like, fear of hell is how religions control everybody. And it's a scary thing. Like, it's, you know, have you ever, instead of trying to logic your way out of it, have you ever just faced it directly and said, what if it is true? Because I say this because this is what I did finally. Like, I got so tired of staying with that question, like, what if it's true? You know, and then I was like, okay, what if it is true? What if everything I taught growing up is true and the cult is the true way
Mhm.
and the only way to heaven, and heaven is the way they preach it and God is the way they preach him? And what if I'm wrong and they're right? What if? And I realized this is like the moment that I stopped asking that question, because I realized that if they were true and the God that I was taught was actually God, I wouldn't want to be in heaven anyway. Like, I wouldn't want to spend eternity with like a douchebag like that, like that, who like, I mean, I could go on for a long time, but just
Yeah,
as
yeah.
example, like this being who created humans, like he created them. He's like omnipotent and he can do anything. And he created these humans. And then he was like, well, you need to please me, but I won't love you unless you're perfect. But you can't be perfect because I've made you with human faults. And that's kind of the point. And so I don't love you because you're not perfect and you're sinning. But it's like he made us, so it's like his fault. And then but he doesn't like take any responsibility for it at all, right? And then
Yeah.
he's like, "Oh, my only son had to die for you." And then Jesus is like, "Oh God, please give her another chance. Please give her, please, please, please." And then God's like, "Okay, fine, fine. She can come into heaven. It's fine, whatever." Like, that's like one of a million examples that I can give you of the absurdity of this God that I was taught, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, if that is true, if what I was taught is actually true, then heaven would be hell and hell would be hell. So I get to choose between hell and hell. Great.
Mhm.
So my afterlife is fucked either way. And
Yeah.
it's torment either way. And all I can really depend on and all I have is now. And so I'm
Mhm.
going to make this life as close to heaven on earth as I can and try to make the world, or try to like leave the world a slightly better place for being in it, because that's
Mhm.
all that I can really stand on. So basically, I was like, even if it is true, I would still come to the same conclusion about how I live my life.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's definitely a really solid point, and something that was, like, one of my first realizations, like I was kind of saying earlier, even when I was, like, a young kid, which was, like, horrifying, was that they're both kind of hell, so, yeah, no, that's
Exactly.
definitely a really good point, and also, like, in that case, Satan doesn't seem so bad, he seems like kind of a cool dude, so,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, he was like, "Oh, God, you're a douchebag. I'm out of here."
Yeah.
I was like, "Okay."
Mhm.
Yeah, cool. Um, what has been your biggest sexual regret?
Hmm. I would say all of the years that I spent just, like, repressing myself from,
Yes.
having sex and also, like, doing the research, and educating myself about sex because, like I said, I didn't really receive any sort of, like, sex ed, and therefore I had like, going into like, when I did eventually start, like, having sex, I really was uneducated about, like, consent, like, I had kind of, like, one idea of what sexual assault was, and so therefore I was, like, super unprepared to go into the world of, like, hooking up with people and, like, casually dating people, which kind of, like, um, was, like, really damaging for me, whereas
Yeah,
if I wasn't, like, repressing all of that, which isn't necessarily, like, my fault, but, like, if I was able to, like, educate myself when I was younger, or if I could have received that education, I could have, like, avoided some, like, initial negative sex experiences, and I would have had, um a less narrow idea of what sex can be or, like, how to please someone or, like I also would have, like,
absolutely.
prioritized my own pleasure more, I think,
Oh,
rather than
yeah.
just, like, being like, "It's my job to make boys happy." Like, yeah, I
Yeah.
guess, like, that's my biggest regret is not educating myself more and not exploring more when I was younger.
It's such a big narrative that girls get.
Yeah.
Makes me so mad.
Yeah, me too.
That's something that sorry, we're running a little bit over time. I have one more question for you.
Yeah, that's okay.
But that's something that the kink world does way better than the vanilla world. I mean, they do more than one thing better, but that is like the biggest thing that stood out to me the most is, before you enter into a scene with somebody or create a scene with somebody, before you play with somebody, you sit down and you talk about, what are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with? Where are your boundaries? Where is your consent? And you both like consent to this thing that you're going to do. And you both know what your role is. And you know, kind of what, like going into it, what's going to happen. And you have like a safe word and like all this stuff is so amazing. And then you have aftercare afterwards where you sit and you like talk about it and or you just offer each other what you need if it's just cuddles or just time or tea or like whatever it
Yeah.
is. And man, if we could like bring that more into the vanilla world, it would make such a big difference. And I mean, maybe that's partly the conversation now that's happening around consent is to do that, right? But
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think at least with my experience in, like, vanilla, like, sex and dating, like, a lot more is assumed within that, which can lead to,
yes,
like, a lot of hurt, and another
totally.
thing that I really enjoy about kink is, like, if you're negotiating properly, there's a lot of discussion around how, like, both or however many parties involved, like, can get something out of the experience, even
Yes.
if it's just, like, doing something for another person, like,
Yeah,
yeah, I feel like it's really focused on how everyone can get something out of the scene or the
absolutely.
situation, so, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I find kink is like it's a good balance of being totally selfish and totally unselfish at the same time. Like it's like, well, I want what I want, but I want everybody else to get what they want too. So let's find a way to make that happen.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is selflessness and, like, being caring under like, kind of playing this role of being selfish, um, like, at least if you're, like a lot of the times I think, like, a dominant person, like, plays this role of, like, "You're giving me exactly what I want," when a lot of the times it's really, like, more catered to,
The
like,
sub.
the sub, and, like, what the
Totally.
sub wants to get out of it,
Absolutely.
but also what the sub gets out of it is the dominant or the top pretending like they're demanding it, so, yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend who's, has kind of an inner dom, and he really only can let it out if the sub is very communicative and he knows the boundaries. And like he said often, like the sub actually, if if you do it right, or like if you talk enough, the sub is the one that actually more has the power,
Yeah,
because it's all
definitely.
within the sub's boundaries. I mean, this dom has their boundaries too, obviously, but they're more like doing too. And so it's totally the sub's boundaries.
Yeah, I think in general, if you have, like, a dominant or a top who is just, like, actually demanding things out of a person without, like, if someone's being like, "I am your dominant, and so this is what you're gonna do for me," that's, like, a huge red flag. Yeah.
Yeah, unless you talked about it and that's what you want.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
totally. Absolutely. Okay. So my last question is, what is one thing you wish you knew as a teenager about sex and sexuality? So that's a little bit similar to the one you just answered, actually. But if there is one thing that you wish you knew, what
Hmm,
would it be?
what?
Nothing, I'm sorry.
Okay,
I was
sorry.
smirking waiting for your answer.
Dick was just, like, laughing at me, so
I wasn't laughing at
I
you.
was like, "What?"
He's just laughing near you.
Yeah, just laughing near me. Hmm. It's so hard because I feel like I would, like, give pretty much the same answer.
About just like having been taught more about sex and sexuality, and knowing more about like consent and voicing your what you want for your own pleasure and everything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would I'm sorry, but I would, like, probably give the same answer. Is just,
No,
like,
no,
I think
you
the
don't have to
most
say sorry.
important thing is, like, having, like, sexual education. Yeah, that's, like, extremely important. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. No need to apologize. No, it's totally. Yeah, I'm with you on that one. That's something that
Yeah.
I'm really passionate about is, I don't know, just teaching kids a more well-rounded approach to sex, and like you said, to teach them about pleasure and consent and having a voice, not just don't have sex, and if you do, use protection so you don't get pregnant. Like,
Yeah,
uh,
definitely. It's like it's interesting. I feel like even though my like school sex ed experience wasn't like Christian, like I didn't go to a Christian school
yeah.
or anything, I still like definitely feel like it was influenced by that like conservative community of just like
Yeah, I mean, our
don't have
whole
sex.
society is
Yeah.
really, and I was the same. I didn't go to a Christian school, but I think our sex ed just came from society, which sucks. Like the,
Yeah.
I mean, the sex education in school sucks, but also just societal sex education sucks. I think it's getting better though. There's more conversation around consent and pleasure and everything like that. So that's good.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the internet has, like, definitely influenced that a lot or, like, people having, like, more access to, like, doing their own research like, more younger people having, access to doing their own research and
Absolutely. Which has
yeah.
its
Ups
downside
and
as well.
downs, yeah.
But I agree with you. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So is there anything that if you were in my shoes, that you would want to ask you
Hmm,
that I haven't asked you?
let me think. Hmm, I guess maybe I would ask where I'm at now with, like, just, like, my outlook on, I guess, like because I feel like I talked about, like, rigid Christianity and then rigid like new age like spirituality type of things, and I feel like I
Yes.
didn't necessarily like say how it evolved from
Yes,
there other than like
totally.
getting into kink and stuff, but
Okay, go for it. Yes.
I feel like it's been really important and like really empowering for me to like not subscribe to any sort of like spiritual rules or like guidelines of like how to live my life. Like it's been really important for me to look inward and ask myself like what I think is important. And I think it's like we were kind of talking about this before, but it can be really challenging to not just like look to a set of rules about like how to live your life. But for me, it's been really freeing and a really like interesting journey, like genuinely asking myself what is important and what like just like how I want to live my life and not like yeah, subscribing to any sort of like rules that are imposed on me by something outside of myself. So,
Yeah, which is a lot more complicated journey to be on than following rules, but way more empowering and way more rewarding, would you say?
yeah, I would definitely say so. I think it can be scary, especially if you were born into being told that you need to follow like sets of rules
So
um
scary.
that tell you how to live your life, but I think it's a lot more fun than people realize, even if it's scary at times.
I think it's scary because when you're taught rules, you're taught not to trust yourself.
Mhm.
And then it's a choice to trust yourself. When you decide to like make up your own mind about stuff, you're choosing to trust yourself.
Mhm.
But that was one of the rules, was to not trust yourself. I think for me anyways, that's why it was
Yeah, for me
so damn
too.
scary and like continues to be so sometimes.
Yeah, it's really like jumping into the deep end when you haven't been allowed to do that for your entire life. But yeah, like I said, even if it's scary, it's like a lot more freeing than you might realize, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly freeing.
Yeah.
Um, it's free. Ironically, it's freeing to take responsibility for yourself
Yeah.
and your beliefs. Usually we think freedom comes in denying responsibility or like not having responsibility. But I find that the more I take responsibility for myself and my life and my thoughts and my choices and my beliefs, the more free I feel.
Yeah. I would totally agree. And also just like bringing it back to like Christianity is like or even just like a lot of like religions, I think the point is that you're not allowed to be free during your life. Like your freedom comes afterwards, which is
Mm.
like a horrible way of thinking, I think, because like you were saying earlier, all we have is like now and all we have is like our life, and to just like in my opinion waste it like just waiting for like your afterlife is like I would be wary of anyone trying to tell you that that's what life should be spent doing, is like not living it.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Mic drop.
uh,
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, I will end it there because we went over a lot over time, but thank you so much for being willing to explore these questions with me and coming on my show. I thoroughly loved it. So, where can people find you?
You can find me every week on the Off the Cuffs podcast, as I mentioned throughout the episode, which you can pretty much listen to on any podcast streaming service. And I also mentioned that I have an Onlyfans if you want to see me naked or see my porn,
Yep.
which is at bydaily666. And I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at bydaily666 if you want to find me on any of those platforms.
Cool. And that's BIDAILY.
Yeah, B-I-D. Wait, why can't I spell it right now? BIDAILY
Yeah.
666.
Okay. Awesome. I loved chatting with you.
Yeah, it was really nice talking to you. Thanks so much for asking me to come on. It was lovely.
Awesome.